He was a man forgotten by time, a ghost walking his own land. His ranch was a kingdom of dust and silence, a place where dreams had come to die and been buried in unmarked graves. Years had passed since his heart had felt anything but the dull ache of emptiness. For him, life had already run its course. It was over. Then came the deal. A deal so cold it could freeze the sun. A young woman, pregnant and alone, betrayed by the one person who should have protected her. Her own mother. Sold off like livestock, a piece of property to be traded. When the rancher looked into her terrified eyes, he didn't see a stranger. He saw a mirror. He saw his own broken soul reflected back at him. He never wanted to buy a person. The thought itself was a poison. But fate, in its cruel and twisted way, had dragged her into his desolate world. At first, it felt like a curse, another heavy stone to carry on his already stooped shoulders. But a flicker of something, deep in the ruins of his heart, told him this was not the end. It was a beginning. What neither of them could possibly know, standing there in the dying light, was that this moment of profound cruelty was the start of something impossible. A miracle that would demand every last drop of their strength, shatter their suffocating silence, and forge the one thing they both craved more than life itself: a family. In a town where hunger was a god and hope was a forgotten prayer, a mother's love had turned to stone. Poverty had chipped away at her soul until all that was left was bitterness. She looked at her daughter, her own flesh and blood, and saw only a mouth to feed, a burden she could no longer bear. The girl, her belly swollen with new life, pleaded for mercy. But her pleas were swallowed by the cold, dead eyes of a woman who had already made her choice. One moonless night, with nothing left to pawn and nothing left to sell, the mother did the unthinkable. She sold her pregnant daughter to a lonely old rancher on the edge of town. The deal was a whisper in the dark. The money was a handful of dirty coins. The pain was a wound that would never close. The rancher, a man whose life had been a long, quiet winter, didn't do it for love. He hadn't felt love in decades. He did it for the hope of a sound, any sound, to break the crushing silence of his empty house. A voice, a footstep, anything other than the wind moaning through the eaves. But when he saw the tears carving tracks through the dirt on her face, a terrible realization hit him. He hadn't bought a companion. He had bought a soul that was already in pieces. The girl, caught in a nightmare between the ultimate betrayal and an unknown fear, stepped onto his property. She carried nothing but the clothes on her back, and a despair so heavy it felt like a physical weight. She had no idea, not a single clue, that this cruel, bitter transaction would be the first step toward a miracle. The night she came to the ranch, silence was her only companion. It clung to her like a shroud. The old house groaned around her, every creak of the floorboards a new threat. The vast, empty plain stretching out in every direction felt colder and more menacing than the betrayal she had just endured. She found a corner in the main room and sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around her belly. Her heart was a trapped bird beating against her ribs. The rancher didn't say much. He was a man of few words, most of them lost to time. He set a coarse wool blanket near her feet, built a fire in the stone hearth, and then he left her alone. To her, this wasn't kindness. It was just a different kind of cage, a bigger one, with higher walls. Every shadow in the house seemed to whisper that she didn't belong, that she was an intruder. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, refusing to meet his gaze, refusing his words. Her pain was a shield, and she held it up against him, against this house, against the world. The rancher watched her from a distance. He was a quiet storm, his emotions churning deep beneath a weathered surface. He had no intention of hurting her. He wasn't that kind of man. But if you asked him why he'd brought her there, he couldn't have given you an honest answer. Maybe he was just tired of being alone. Maybe he saw a flicker of his own past in her frightened eyes. His routine didn't change. He was up before the sun, out in the fields, working until his muscles screamed and the sun bled across the horizon. Every evening, he'd return to the same scene. The girl, sitting by the window, staring out at the endless land as if plotting an escape she knew she could never make. She barely ate. She never spoke. And when the storms rolled in across the plains, filling the night with thunder and wind, she would cry. Softly, so no one could hear. But he heard. He heard every stifled sob that echoed through the thin walls of the old house. He never went to her, never opened her door. That was a line he wouldn't cross. But he started leaving a tray of food outside her room each night. When he noticed the roof over her bed had a leak, he was up there the next morning, patching it before the next rain. He stacked fresh firewood by her hearth, making sure she'd never have to feel the biting cold of the night. She never said thank you. She never even acknowledged him. But she noticed. Her eyes, red and swollen from crying, started to follow him. A man who bought her like she was a sack of grain was now protecting her like she was something precious. The contradiction confused her, unsettled her. Her heart, still bleeding from her mother's betrayal, was too wounded to even consider the possibility of trust. Every act of kindness felt like a trick, a manipulation, a prelude to some new horror. Days melted into weeks. The chasm of silence between them remained. But something was changing within that silence. A single fragile thread was being spun, connecting two broken souls across an empty room. He started to understand her without words. He saw the way she struggled to carry a full bucket of water from the well, and the next day, he'd have two fresh buckets waiting on the porch for her. He saw how the thunder made her jump, and now, on stormy nights, he kept a lantern lit in the hallway outside her door until the sun came up. She fought against it. She reminded herself, over and over, that she was a piece of property. She was sold, not saved. But his quiet, relentless care chipped away at her defenses. This wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. It was something else, something she'd never experienced before. It was respect. Still, the ranch felt like a prison. The endless fields were not a promise of freedom, but a reminder of how trapped she was. She would rest her hands on her growing belly and wonder what kind of life her child would have here, born into a world of sorrow and silence. She couldn't see a future. All she saw were shadows. The rancher had his own shadows. He never pushed her, never asked for her trust, never demanded anything from her. He simply existed, a quiet presence in her life. But deep down, a desperate hope began to grow. A hope that the walls she had built around herself might one day, brick by painful brick, come tumbling down. He had waited so long for another person to share his world. And now that she was here, he understood that the real challenge wasn't just having her in his house. The real challenge was healing her spirit. And though she couldn't see it yet, though her fear was still a blindfold over her eyes, their story was already hurtling toward a moment that would shatter everything they thought they knew. A moment that would change them both, forever. The silence between them didn't break. It transformed. It was no longer a weapon, a wall of ice. It became a language of its own. At first, she dismissed his kindness as a sense of duty, the bare minimum an owner might show for his property. But then the details started to pile up, small things that she couldn't ignore. The window in her room, which had been cracked since she arrived, was suddenly replaced with a new pane of glass. The splintered wood on her doorframe was sanded smooth, so her sleeve wouldn't catch on it anymore. And the blanket he'd given her that first night, it always seemed to be warm, and she realized he was placing it by the fire to heat it before he left it for her each evening. He never mentioned any of it. He never looked for a word of thanks. He just did it. And in those quiet, unspoken actions, she began to see something that had been absent from her entire life. Care without condition. It wasn't a transaction. He wanted nothing in return. One afternoon, she had to go into town for supplies. The rancher drove her in his old, rattling truck. As they walked through the marketplace, the whispers started. She could feel the eyes on her swollen belly. She could hear the snickers, the cruel words passed from person to person. "That's the one," they'd say. "Sold by her own mother." The judgment was a physical blow, and she felt herself shrinking, the old shame and fear rising up to choke her. But before the town's scorn could break her, he moved. He didn't say a word. He didn't confront anyone. He simply stepped closer to her, positioning himself between her and the worst of the stares. His presence was a silent, unmovable shield. He was telling them, without a single word, that she was not alone. Not anymore. For the first time since she'd been torn from her home, she felt a flicker of safety. Standing beside this silent, weathered man, it felt as if the cruelty of the world couldn't quite reach her. That night, back at the ranch, her mind was a whirlwind. But when she looked at him, she saw something different. The fear was still there, a ghost in the back of her mind, but a new feeling was pushing its way through the cracks in her heart. Trust. A tiny, fragile seed breaking through solid stone. She realized he had never once raised his voice to her. He had never laid a hand on her. He had never treated her as anything less than a person. His actions were a promise, louder and more true than any words could ever be. And slowly, painfully, the heart she thought was broken beyond repair began to soften. Their days continued in quiet rhythm, but the silence now was comfortable, a shared space rather than an empty one. He would be in the fields, and she would find herself preparing a small meal for his return. Not because he asked, but because she wanted to. It was her own silent way of saying thank you. They started to share glances across the dinner table, and in those fleeting moments, a connection was being forged, something real and powerful that neither of them understood. At night, when the wind howled and rattled the windows, she no longer cried herself to sleep. She would lie in bed and listen for the sound of his steady footsteps in the hallway, a quiet patrol that made her feel safe. The sound was enough. It was everything. He felt the change in her, too. He saw that the fear in her eyes was being replaced by something else. A spark. A question. It was delicate, so fragile he was almost afraid to breathe on it for fear of putting it out. But it was real. For so many years his life had been defined by silence. But now, that same silence was filled with a meaning he never thought he'd experience again. A bond that didn't need words. Two lost souls, adrift in a sea of pain, were slowly, cautiously, finding their way to each other. They were a lighthouse for each other in the dark. What had begun as a heartless, cruel deal was becoming something else entirely. Something unexpected, something beautiful. A bond built not on chains or money, but on quiet respect, and a silent shared hope that maybe, just maybe, they were being given a second chance. But their fragile peace was not destined to last. Just as they were learning to navigate their quiet world, a shadow from the past was creeping toward them, a shadow that threatened to devour the tiny flicker of light they had found. One evening, as the sun was setting, a horse and rider appeared on the horizon. The rider was a man the rancher recognized instantly. Sheriff Brody, a man with a cold heart and a long memory. Brody had been the one to investigate the accident that had taken the rancher's family years ago. An investigation that had been closed in a day, ruled a tragic misfortune. The rancher knew better. He knew Brody had covered something up. Brody dismounted, his eyes sweeping over the property before landing on the girl, who was standing on the porch. A cruel smirk played on his lips. "Heard you got yourself some company, old man," Brody said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Town's buzzing about it." The rancher stepped in front of the girl, blocking her from Brody's view. "State your business, Sheriff." "Just a friendly visit," Brody said, his eyes glinting. "Making sure everything's legal. Wouldn't want anyone taking advantage of a poor, unfortunate girl, now would we?" The threat was clear. Brody knew something about the deal. Or he suspected. This wasn't a friendly visit. It was a warning. The rancher's past, a past he thought he had buried, was coming back to haunt him. And it was putting the girl, the one person he now felt a desperate need to protect, directly in danger. As Brody rode away, the fragile peace of the ranch shattered. The girl looked at the rancher, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. She didn't know the history between the two men, but she could feel the tension, the unspoken hatred. She had escaped one monster, her mother, only to find herself caught in a struggle between two more. That night, the silence returned, but it was different. It was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and the looming threat of Sheriff Brody. The rancher knew Brody wouldn't let this go. He was like a vulture, circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. And the rancher also knew, with a chilling certainty, that Brody's visit was not a coincidence. Someone had sent him. He looked over at the girl, who was staring into the fire, her face a mask of anxiety. He had brought her into his world to save her from hers. But what if he had only dragged her into a bigger, more dangerous storm? The fragile thread of trust between them was now being tested, stretched to its breaking point. And the worst part was, the storm hadn't even truly begun. The sheriff's visit was a stone tossed into a still pond, and the ripples were spreading fast. The girl felt the change immediately. The rancher became more withdrawn, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, as if expecting an attack. The quiet safety she had started to feel on the ranch evaporated, replaced by a constant, low-level hum of anxiety. She started to wonder what he was hiding. Who was this sheriff, and what power did he hold over the silent man who had taken her in? The locked door at the end of the hallway, the one he never opened, suddenly seemed more sinister. What secrets was he keeping in there? Was he a good man caught in a bad situation, or was he something else entirely? Her doubt, fueled by fear, began to eat away at the trust she had so carefully started to build. She began to see his kindness not as genuine, but as a tactic, a way to keep her compliant, a way to control her. The old fears came rushing back. She was his property, after all. What was to stop him from handing her over to the sheriff if it meant saving himself? One afternoon, while he was out mending a fence on the far side of the property, her curiosity and fear got the better of her. She found herself standing in front of the locked door. Her hand trembled as she reached out and tried the knob. It was locked, just as she knew it would be. But this time, she wouldn't be deterred. She found a thin piece of wire in a toolbox, and with fumbling fingers, began to work the old, simple lock. After a few tense minutes, she heard a click. The door swung open with a low groan. The room was dark, the air thick with the smell of dust and disuse. She stepped inside, her heart pounding. It wasn't a prison. It wasn't a torture chamber. It was a child's bedroom. A small wooden rocking horse stood in the corner, covered in a white sheet like a tiny ghost. A crib sat against the far wall. On a small dresser, there was a collection of faded photographs. She picked one up. It was the rancher, years younger, his face alight with a happiness she couldn't imagine. He had his arm around a smiling woman, and in his other arm, he was holding a small child. His family, the family he had lost. Suddenly, his silence made sense. His sorrow, the emptiness in his eyes, the reason he had bought a stranger to fill his house with a sound, any sound. He wasn't hiding a dark secret. He was guarding a broken heart. Tears streamed down her face as she looked around the room, a shrine to a life that had been stolen from him. She felt a wave of shame for ever doubting him. He hadn't been trying to control her. He had been trying to protect her, just as he had failed to protect them. But then she saw something else. Tucked behind the photograph was a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline was stark: "Ranching Family Perishes in Tragic Fire." She read the article, her blood running cold. It described a fire that had swept through the ranch house one night. The rancher had been in town, delayed by a sudden errand. His wife and child were trapped inside. The investigation, led by a young Sheriff Brody, had concluded it was an accident. Faulty wiring. A tragic misfortune. But at the bottom of the article was a small, handwritten note. It was barely legible. The ink faded with time. Brody is lying. It wasn't an accident. They were murdered. She dropped the clipping as if it had burned her. Murdered. The word echoed in the silent room. This wasn't just a story of loss. It was a story of a crime, a cover-up, and Sheriff Brody was at the center of it. Suddenly a floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The rancher was standing in the doorway, his face a thundercloud of shock and anger. He looked from her to the newspaper clipping in her hand. The silence between them was no longer a comfort. It was an accusation. "You shouldn't be in here," he said, his voice a low growl she had never heard before. She had crossed a line. She had unearthed a secret he had kept buried for years. And in doing so, she had not only broken his trust, but she had also put herself in unimaginable danger. Because now, she knew the truth. And in a town run by a corrupt sheriff, knowing the truth could get you killed. The rancher's anger was a wall between them, but behind it, she could see the pain. The raw, open wound that she had just ripped open. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words feeling small and useless. "I didn't know." He didn't answer. He just stared at the room, at the ghosts of his past she had disturbed. The trust they had built, so fragile and new, seemed to crumble into dust around them. He had let her into his home, and she had repaid him by digging up the one thing that could destroy him. But the fear that had been her constant companion was now being replaced by something else. A cold, hard anger of her own. This man had suffered an unimaginable loss, and the person responsible was still walking free, wearing a badge and terrorizing the town. He wasn't just a threat to the rancher, he was a threat to her, and to her unborn child. "We have to do something," she said, her voice stronger now. "You can't let him get away with this." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were full of a despair so deep it scared her. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Brody doesn't work alone. The whole town is in his pocket. The judge, the mayor, they all owe him. They helped him cover it up then, and they'll help him cover it up now. There's no one to go to. No one will help us." It was a hopeless situation. They were trapped, two people against a corrupt system, with a secret that could get them both killed. The ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was a target, and Sheriff Brody knew they had something to hide. That night, the tension in the house was unbearable. They sat in silence, but it was a silence filled with the ghosts of the past and the fear of the future. The girl now understood the stakes. This wasn't just about her and her baby anymore. It was about justice for a murdered woman and child. As she lay in bed, unable to sleep, she heard a noise outside, a twig snapping. She sat up, her heart racing. Peeking through the curtains, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching the house. It was too dark to make out a face, but she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that it wasn't the rancher. They were being watched. Brody had sent someone. The warning had been delivered, and now the waiting game was over. They were coming for them. The next few days were a blur of paranoia. Every creak of the house, every shadow that moved, was a potential threat. The rancher started carrying his old rifle with him wherever he went. They boarded up some of the windows, turning the house into a fortress. But they both knew it was useless. If Brody wanted to get to them, he would. The psychological toll was immense. The girl, already fragile, was nearing her breaking point. The stress was causing sharp pains in her belly, and she was terrified for the health of her baby. They were prisoners in their own home, waiting for an attack that could come at any moment. Then, one evening, A new visitor arrived. Not the sheriff, but a man she had never seen before. He was tall and thin, with a cruel face and eyes that were cold and empty. He rode up to the ranch as if he owned it, a swagger in his step. "I'm looking for a girl," he said, his voice a low drawl. He was looking directly at her as she stood on the porch. "Her mother sent me, said she was worried about her." Her blood ran cold. Her mother. This was the man her mother had mentioned. The dangerous man. The man who was supposedly the baby's father. But the girl knew the truth. The father of her child was a sweet boy from her village, a boy who had been run out of town by her mother's cruelty. This man was a stranger, a liar. "She's not here," the rancher said, stepping in front of her, the rifle held loosely in his hands. The man, Silas, smirked. "Oh, I think she is. And I think you know that her mother wants her back. Along with the baby. There's a lot of money riding on that baby." The truth hit her like a physical blow. This was never about protecting her. Her mother hadn't sold her to the rancher to keep her safe. She had sold the baby. The rancher was just a temporary holding place, a remote location to stash her until the baby was born. And now, the buyer was here to collect his property. The rancher raised the rifle. "You're not taking anyone. Get off my land." Silas just laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You're a fool, old man. You think that pea shooter is going to stop me? I'm not alone." He gestured back toward the road, and two more men emerged from the trees, both armed. "You're outnumbered. Give us the girl, and we'll let you live out the rest of your miserable days in peace." It was a standoff. The rancher was a good man, but he was old. He was one man against three. The situation was hopeless. The girl looked at his face, at the grim determination in his eyes, and she knew he would die before he let them take her. He was going to sacrifice himself for her, a girl he barely knew, a girl he had bought for a few dollars. In that moment, all her fear, all her pain, coalesced into a single point of white-hot rage. She would not let another person she cared about be destroyed by the cruelty of others. She would not stand by and watch this good man die for her. Just as Silas and his men started to advance, a new sound cut through the tense air. The rumble of an engine. A truck was speeding up the long driveway. It was Sheriff Brody. But he wasn't alone. He had two deputies with him. For a fleeting second, she felt a surge of hope. The law was here. They would be saved. But then Brody got out of his truck, a wide grin on his face. He walked over to Silas and clapped him on the shoulder. "Having some trouble, Silas?" he asked. Silas spat on the ground. "Nothing I can't handle. This old fool is more stubborn than I thought." Brody turned his cold eyes on the rancher. "You're making a big mistake, friend. These men have a legal claim. The girl's mother signed the papers herself. They're here to take custody of the child, and as the law in this town, I'm here to see that it's done peacefully. It was a conspiracy. Her mother, Silas, the sheriff, they were all in on it. This was a kidnapping, sanctioned and supported by the law. They had been checkmated. There was no escape." As the men closed in, a sudden sharp pain shot through the girl's abdomen, so intense it made her cry out and double over. Her water had broken. The stress, the fear, it had all been too much. The baby was coming. Now. The timing couldn't have been worse. It was a disaster. But it was also, perhaps, their only chance. The rancher saw his opening. "The baby's coming!" he yelled. "She needs a doctor! You can't move her now!" Brody and Silas exchanged a look. This complicated things. A baby born on the ranch was one thing. A dead mother or child was another. It would bring unwanted attention, questions they couldn't answer. "Fine," Brody said after a moment. "We'll wait, but don't think for a second this changes anything. As soon as that baby is born, it's ours. And so is she." He motioned to his deputies. "Secure the house. They're not going anywhere." The ranch had become a prison. They were surrounded, trapped, with a baby on the way. As another contraction ripped through her, the girl looked at the rancher, her eyes pleading. His face was grim, but he gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't over yet. He still had a plan. He had to. Because if he didn't, she and her baby were doomed. The house was an armed camp. Brody's deputies patrolled the perimeter, while Silas and his men sat on the porch, waiting like vultures. Inside, the rancher did his best to make the girl comfortable, but the situation was dire. The pains were getting closer together, more intense. She needed a midwife, a doctor, someone who knew what they were doing. "What are we going to do?" she gasped, clutching his hand as another wave of pain washed over her. "There's a midwife," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Martha. She lives on the other side of the valley. If we can get to her, she can help." "Get to her? How? We're surrounded." "There's a storm coming," he said, looking out the window at the darkening sky. "A big one. They'll be expecting us to stay put, to ride it out. That's when we'll move, under the cover of the storm." It was a desperate, insane plan. To venture out into a raging storm, with her in labor, while being hunted by armed men. But it was their only chance. As night fell, the storm hit with a terrifying fury. Wind howled like a banshee, and rain hammered against the house in solid sheets. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations of the old building. It was the perfect cover. The rancher waited until the storm was at its peak. He wrapped the girl in every blanket he could find, lifted her into his arms, and headed for the back door. She was light, but the weight of their situation felt immense. They slipped out into the raging storm, the wind and rain so powerful it was like stepping into a solid wall of water. He knew the property better than anyone, every dip and rise, every tree and rock. He used that knowledge to navigate through the darkness, away from the house, away from the guards. It was a brutal journey. Mud sucked at his boots, trying to pull him down. The wind tore at them, trying to rip her from his arms. Every step was a battle. She cried out in pain with each contraction, her screams lost in the roar of the storm. He held her tighter, whispering words of encouragement, promising her they would make it. They had almost reached the tree line, the edge of the property, when a beam of light cut through the darkness. One of the deputies had spotted them. "They're getting away!" a voice yelled, followed by the crack of a gunshot. The bullet whizzed past his head, so close he could feel the heat of it. Panic surged through him, but he didn't stop. He pushed forward, deeper into the woods, using the trees for cover. They were being hunted. The journey to the midwife was no longer just a race against time. It was a race against death. He could hear them crashing through the undergrowth behind them, their lights bobbing in the darkness. They were gaining. He was old, and he was carrying a heavy burden. He couldn't outrun them for long. Just as he felt his strength beginning to fail, he saw it. A faint light flickering through the trees. Martha's cabin. They were close. So close. With the last of his energy, he stumbled out of the woods and toward the cabin. The door flew open before he reached it. An old woman with a kind, weathered face stood there holding a lantern. "Martha." "Get her inside, quickly," she said, her voice calm and steady despite the chaos. He carried the girl into the warm, dry cabin and laid her gently on a bed. He was shaking, exhausted, his heart pounding in his chest. But they had made it. They were safe, for now. Martha was a whirlwind of efficiency, checking on the girl, her hands gentle but firm. "The baby's coming, and soon," she said. "You did good getting her here." But their relief was short-lived. Through the windows, they could see the lights of their pursuers spreading out, circling the cabin. Brody and his men knew where they were. They were trapped again. The rancher grabbed his rifle, his face set in grim lines. "I'll hold them off," he said. "Don't be a fool," Martha said, not looking up from her work. "You'll be dead in minutes. There's another way." She looked at him, and her eyes were filled with a fierce intelligence. "You know who I am, right? You know whose sister I was." The rancher stared at her. Martha wasn't just a midwife. She was his late wife's sister, his sister-in-law. "I know what Brody did," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I know he killed my sister and her child, and I've spent the last 20 years gathering proof. Letters, testimonies from people he's threatened. I have everything. Enough to put him away for life." A sliver of hope cut through the rancher's despair. "Where is it?" "Hidden," she said. "But I'll tell you where. You just have to promise me one thing. You make sure that girl and her baby get out of here alive. You protect them, the way you couldn't protect my sister." It was a promise he had already made to himself. He nodded, his throat too tight for words. As another contraction seized the girl, and the lights of their hunters drew closer, the final desperate pieces of a plan began to fall into place. It was a long shot, a gamble with their lives on the line. But for the first time, they had a weapon more powerful than a gun. They had the truth. The cabin was a tiny island of warmth in a sea of darkness and violence. Outside, the storm raged, and Brody's men circled like sharks. Inside, the girl's world had shrunk to the space of the small bed, her reality a cycle of blinding pain and brief, gasping moments of relief. The rancher stood guard by the door, rifle in hand, while Martha, his sister-in-law, worked with a calm focus that defied the chaos. "He's not going to just let us walk out of here," the rancher said, his voice a low rumble. "Even if we have proof, he'll kill us all before he lets that information see the light of day." "He won't have a choice," Martha said, her eyes never leaving the girl. "There's a logging road that runs behind this cabin. It's old and washed out, but your truck can make it. It leads to the next county. Brody's jurisdiction ends at the river. If you can get them across that bridge, you'll be free." It was a race to deliver a baby, and a race to an imaginary line on a map that meant the difference between life and death. The girl screamed as another contraction hit, harder this time. "I can't do it," she sobbed, her strength failing. "Yes, you can," the rancher said, moving to her side, taking her hand. He looked into her eyes, no longer seeing a stranger but a fighter, a survivor. "You are the strongest person I have ever met. You can do this." His words, his belief in her, gave her a surge of strength. She bore down, her cry mixing with the howl of the wind outside. Suddenly there was a loud bang as the cabin door was kicked in. Sheriff Brody stood there, rain-soaked and furious, his gun pointed directly at the rancher. "It's over, old man. The game is up." Silas and his men pushed in behind him, their weapons ready. The rancher didn't flinch. He simply stood between Brody and the bed, a human shield. "You'll have to kill me first," he said. Brody laughed. "That can be arranged." "Before you do," Martha's voice cut through the tension, sharp as a razor, "you should know that a package was sent to the state marshal's office this afternoon. It contains a full confession. My confession, detailing how you, Sheriff Brody, murdered my sister and her child, how you set that fire and covered it up. It also details this little kidnapping scheme. That package is set to be opened tomorrow morning unless I call and give them a code word." Brody's face went pale. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Martha asked, a cold smile on her face. "Kill us, and my testimony from the grave puts you on death row. Let us go and I'll make the call. You'll lose the baby, but you'll keep your life. What's it going to be, Brody?" It was a brilliant, desperate checkmate. Brody was trapped. He could see the truth in her eyes. He was shaking with rage, his whole plan, his whole life, falling apart in this tiny cabin. At that exact moment, a new sound filled the room. Not a scream of pain, but the sharp, piercing cry of a newborn baby. Everyone froze. The sound of new life, in a room so thick with the threat of death, was a shock to the system. Martha finished cleaning the baby, a beautiful, healthy boy, and placed him in his mother's arms. The girl looked down at her son, tears of pain and joy streaming down her face. And then she saw it. On the baby's shoulder, a small, dark birthmark, shaped almost like a star. Her eyes shot up to meet the rancher's. He was staring at the birthmark, his face a mask of disbelief. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, faded photograph, the one from the bedroom. It was his lost son. And on the child's shoulder, in the exact same spot, was the exact same birthmark. It was impossible, a coincidence. It had to be. But in that moment, something shifted in the universe. A connection was made, a link between the past and the present, a miracle that defied all logic. Brody saw the look on the rancher's face, saw the photograph, and he understood. He let out a choked, desperate sound. The last piece of his control was slipping away. The rancher looked from the baby to Brody, and for the first time since his family was murdered, the despair in his eyes was replaced by a burning, righteous fire. "Get out," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Get out before I forget who I am and do something we'll all regret." Faced with Martha's evidence and the rancher's newfound fury, Brody knew he was beaten. He slowly lowered his gun. He gave Silas a look, and the men began to back out of the cabin, their faces a mixture of anger and defeat. They were gone. The threat had passed. As the sun began to rise, the storm broke. The rancher stood by the window, watching the last of the clouds drift away. He turned and looked at the girl, a new mother, cradling her child. Her child. His child? The question hung in the air, a beautiful, impossible mystery. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that what had started as a cruel bargain had led them to this moment, this miracle. He had lost his family once, but now, against all odds, fate had given him a new one. The emptiness that had haunted him for so long was gone, replaced by a feeling so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. Hope. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and full of a trust that was now unbreakable. She held the baby out to him. "Hold your grandson," she whispered. His hands shook as he took the small bundle. He looked down at the tiny, perfect face, and a single tear traced a path through the dust and wrinkles on his cheek. The silence in his life had finally been broken, not by just any sound, but by the most beautiful sound in the world. The soft, gentle breathing of a baby. What began in darkness had ended in the light of a new dawn. A family, born not of blood, but of pain and courage and hope, was finally whole. And as the sun rose higher, casting a warm glow over the quiet ranch, they knew their journey was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story of justice and second chances, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales that prove even in the darkest of nights, a new day is always on its way.